Thanks, Tim, and good afternoon. It's nice to be here and also to speak amongst these very big organizations when the Rockefeller Foundation, while it has quite a global presence, doesn't have, I think, the kind of funding leverage that that USAID or DFID or the EU have. But I think that with our $4 billion corpus and $200 million a year efforts, we've really tried to focus on leveraging that funding for change. And our efforts in the resilience area have been really quite a journey, I think, over the past decade or so. You may know that resilience is one of two of our main goals in the foundation. We view resilience as a way to, strengthen the adaptive capacities of people, institutions, and systems to not only survive and adapt in the face of shocks and stresses, but indeed to thrive. And that sits alongside another goal, which is around inclusive economies. It's really focused on equity. And I think in our, over the past, since Dr. Roden has joined the foundation, we've really focused on field building, if you will, on resilience, trying to be supportive of the research and analysis around resilience thinking and what the concepts actually mean to us, but also to others, and how we might be able to actually invest in the practice of resilience. So we've really spent some time focusing on the notion of building the field of resilience by supporting lots of thought leadership, research and analysis, but also having a bit of risk capital. And I think some of our earlier investments, many of you may know, the Asian Cities Climate Change Resilience Network started in 2008 with a focus primarily on climate resilience. But through that, we've had some really interesting learning and a different perspective that's evolved over the years around what resilience means, not only just in the climate perspective, but how we can take a more holistic and integrative view of resilience through a more systems perspective. And that has really helped us to refine our thinking over the years. I can recall the discussion initially being about vulnerability on the one side and resilience on the other. And we've just been going through iterations over the years, learning from the ACERN process and having, I think, a more nuanced understanding that it's actually breakdown, total disruption on one end, and the idea of how one can transform in the face of some shocks and stresses as a result of having supportive adaptive, having built adaptive capacities within communities and people. And I think this is where we continue, right? I think we were just talking before coming here that just a couple of years ago, many of us were still trying to define what the concept meant for our institutions. And I think we're now a bit beyond defining what it means to, still refining that, of course, but really focused on its practice and what kinds of things help to support promise in the way of building resilience in various communities. And I'm really happy that during this entire conference, we've been focused so much on measurement and how we, when we see it, do we know it when we see it kind of thing? Do we know a resilient community when we see it? That's certainly an area where we've been focusing a good deal. But for this discussion, and given that we want to have time for Q&A, I just wanted to focus in particular on four things with the view of how how, I used to work for USAID, so I had a slip there. How the Rockefeller Foundation has institutionalized resilience. So the 4 points I want to mention, the first is really how we come to problem definition. And what is our process for new understandings of a particular problem space and a particular system? And this whole question of complex adaptive systems and how we can come out of our silos of looking at health or food security or disaster response or risk management in the context of the notion of business continuity for the business sector, and how can we have a more systemic view of the challenges that we face in particular regions, in particular in the regions that we've been talking about, the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, some parts of South and Southeast Asia. So we've really focused on the opportunity of that process, that multi-stakeholder consultative engagement with a variety of groups across not just in one sector, but including other important sectors, to help come up with this new problem identification, new way of thinking about resilience, new understandings of what resilience means. And that's certainly the case in our ACERN work over the years, and working in 10 cities across 4 countries, where we've really spent the time required to engage in a process that allows the stakeholders to see the challenges that they face differently, to look across sectors and across the silos that we all know too well. So that's one area, and maybe we can talk a little bit about that when we get to the Q&A, what that means. The second point that I want to mention in terms of how we have tried to institutionalize resilience through some of our investments and encouraging others is indeed through the point of networks, not just any old network. You know, obviously we have the very esteemed Resilience Learning Consortium, which is a network of organizations that many of the folks, like Tim and Greg in particular, have been engaged in those kinds of things, but ones that are quite generative, that produces a continual flow of new and instructional approaches to thinking about resilience. And we're very much focused on how to build the kinds of networks that would allow that innovative thinking around new investments and new approaches to resilience. So to take a new investment that we have, which is 100 Resilient Cities, that was just announced last year, that's the whole, the nature of that effort really, is to how can we create networks of city resilience officers and others who are supporting them in various places throughout the world, to be supportive of one another, but also to have some new learning around what it means to be resilient, particularly in an urban context, and where it's so different in so many different places. But that's another point that I want to mention. A third area is around innovative finance, and this is another piece that we have really focused on at the foundation. We also very different from perhaps some of the other institutions here, but also I think it's a complementary approach to thinking about these issues is how can we have market-based solutions to some of the issues that we're facing, and how do we look at that from a social change perspective. And so our investments in sovereign risk pools here on the continent with the Africa Risk Capacity is one example of that. Some of our investments as well, along with Oxfam and others, around the weather-based indexed insurance. Harita, that started here in Ethiopia, that's also moving to Senegal, is yet another. I think it's called R4 now, is another example of that. We're also very much investing in what we're calling resilience insurance. Not just for smallholder farmers, but if we think about universal design in some aspects around these issues, how do we think about insurance in other contexts, urban contexts, and contexts outside of where we are working as well. And maybe lastly, there's been some real interest generated in the notions of impact bonds, and how we can move from the learning around social impact bonds to looking at that in a development context. And how we can think about its application, a potential application, I would say, for resilience. And there's certainly a good deal of due diligence there, but again, you may know Rockefeller, we like to push the envelope on things and really be pioneering in our efforts to think through some of these key issues. And so our efforts to embark on the research and analysis around a resilience impact bond, it seems to be quite exciting. We look forward to thinking about that a little bit more carefully. The fourth and last point that I'd like to mention is really around the notion of investment and leadership. And we were talking about the extent to which change happens and institutionalizing resilience thinking for many of our organizations. And I think many of my fellow panelists here have commented that it hasn't been kind of a top-down approach in many cases, and it hasn't been more of an institutional approach. It's been individuals in those institutions that have really pushed for change and have really been able to get people to think beyond the current context of what we mean by resilience, either from the past learnings of psychology or ecology, but how has that evolved to this more, I guess, socio-ecological environment that we're all trying to deal with the added, obviously, complications of governance questions that we're trying to grapple with as well. But leadership for us, it's, I think the 100 Resilient Cities, the innovation in that is in part, how do we support a chief resilience officer? The idea that you'd have one person with support from others in an institution or an administration that might be able to think through some of these things, really look around the corner at new ideas. There's been a lot of discussion around the ecological impacts, there's resilience, social resilience, but how can we start to have conversations around economic resilience, particularly given that so many of these communities are also faced not just by rapid onset disasters and shocks, but also by stresses like financial crises and and food price fluctuations and all of this. And so how can we be thinking differently about that? And so investing in leaders like a chief resilience officer and many others is another way that we have really tried to institutionalize this concept. Maybe finally, I'll just say, and I'm happy to be on time, that, I think the challenge ahead of us now is around this measurement question, is understanding the variables and the metrics and the various dimensions around measurement, and for us to really be clear about what is it that we're measuring. I think one of the interesting challenges about resilience is, the question of resilience of what to what, and trying to understand where you are in the system and all of that. And I think that's in part why we've all collectively grappled with this, because we're trying to measure things at so many different scales, so many different dimensions, that it's hard to really come down to one. So in an earlier session today, there was discussion about having kind of common metrics across. And I think, on the one hand, that seems to be something that would be value add, but the value proposition is understanding how to look at the measurements in different areas and systems, and perhaps it doesn't lend this to common approaches to doing it, but that we need to really figure out the particular variables that are important for that whatever context that we're working in. So let me just leave it there and look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Sam.